There is a government report from 1983 that spends most of 90 pages showing how the Thatcher government missed the warning signs before Argentina invaded the Falklands. Then, in its very last paragraph, it announces that the government was not to blame. Both of those things are in the same document. The Falkland Islands are a scatter of windswept land in the South Atlantic, about 300 miles off the coast of Argentina and 8,000 miles from Britain. Britain had governed them since 1833. Argentina had claimed them for just as long, calling them Las Malvinas. For most of the 20th century, this was a slow diplomatic argument conducted in memos and United Nations resolutions. On the 2nd of April 1982, it stopped being slow. Argentine forces came ashore, overwhelmed a garrison of fewer than 80 Royal Marines, and raised their flag. Within a day, the islands were Argentine. Britain then fought a 74-day war across the South Atlantic to take them back, at a cost of around 900 lives on both sides. When the shooting stopped, one question would not go away. How had the invasion come as a surprise? Britain ran a vast intelligence apparatus. It had diplomats in Buenos Aires and a claim to the islands stretching back a century and a half. So on the 6th of July, 1982, less than a month after the fighting ended, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher set up an inquiry. It would be led by Lord Franks. Oliver Franks was about as establishment as a man could be. A former ambassador to Washington, a former head of an Oxford college, the kind of figure Whitehall reached for when it wanted an answer that would be believed. His committee had 6 members, drawn from across the parties, including the Labour former Home Secretary Merlin Rees and the Conservative former Chancellor Lord Barber. They were made privy councillors so they could be trusted with the most secret material in the state. And they were given something inquiries almost never get: access to the raw intelligence, cabinet papers, diplomatic cables, and the assessments of the Joint Intelligence Committee, the body that pulls together every strand of British intelligence into a single judgment for ministers. Their instructions were narrow and precise. They were to review the way the responsibilities of government had been discharged in the period leading up to the invasion. The report was published on the 18th of January 1983 as a command paper. And to understand why its ending is so strange, you have to walk through what its own pages laid out. Start with the signals Britain was sending long before any invasion. In 1981, the Defense Secretary John Nott produced a review of the armed forces. Among its economies was the withdrawal of HMS Endurance, the Royal Navy's ice patrol ship, and effectively Britain's only permanent naval presence in the South Atlantic. The report records that this decision was noticed in Buenos Aires. So was the British Nationality Act of 1981, which reorganized citizenship in a way that stripped many Falkland Islanders of their full British nationality. To the Argentine junta, both looked like the same thing: a Britain quietly losing interest in a distant colony it could not afford to defend. Next, the intelligence itself. The Joint Intelligence Committee had looked hard at Argentina in July 1981. Its assessment that summer warned, in effect, that if Argentina concluded there was no hope of getting the islands through negotiation, it might well turn to more forcible measures. That is not a vague worry. That is the central warning of the entire crisis, written down more than 8 months before the invasion. And here is what the Franks report documents next. After that assessment, the machinery went quiet. The Joint Intelligence Committee did not formally reassess the Falklands situation again before the crisis broke. The one body designed to connect the dots had, in the words the report itself lays out, given its warning and then moved on. Meanwhile, the diplomacy was collapsing. In February 1982, British and Argentine officials met in New York for another round of talks about the island's future. The talks went nowhere. Afterwards, Argentina issued a communiqué warning that if a settlement was not reached quickly, it reserved the right to seek other means. Again, that is on the record. Again, it is in the report. Then came the incident that lit the fuse. In March 1982, a group of Argentine scrap metal workers, under a contractor named Constantino Davidoff, landed on South Georgia, a British dependency further out in the South Atlantic. They had a contract to dismantle old whaling stations. But on the 19th of March, they raised the Argentine flag. What might have been a commercial dispute became a question of sovereignty and national pride. The junta, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri, with the Navy Chief Admiral Jorge Anaya pushing hardest, seized on the moment. Historians agree the invasion had originally been contemplated for later in the year. The South Georgia flashpoint pulled the timetable forward. By the end of March, intelligence of Argentine naval movements was reaching London. On the 31st of March, Thatcher was told that an Argentine fleet was at sea and heading for the islands. In a now famous meeting, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Henry Leach, told her that Britain could assemble a task force and should send it. But by then, the ships were already sailing. The invasion came on the 2nd of April. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, resigned 3 days later, taking responsibility for the diplomatic failure, along with 2 of his junior ministers. So that is the story the Franks report tells across its length. A ship withdrawn. A citizenship act that signaled retreat. A clear intelligence warning in July 1981, followed by silence. A collapsing negotiation. A public Argentine threat. A flag on South Georgia. A fleet at sea. Read it as a chain, and it reads like a case for the prosecution. And then you reach the conclusion. In its penultimate substantive paragraph, paragraph 338, the committee acknowledged in careful language that there were matters which, had they been handled differently, might have led to a different outcome. It even raised the possibility that a warning deployment, such as sending a nuclear submarine south earlier, might have given Argentina pause. Everything about that paragraph points one direction. Then comes paragraph 339, and it turns the other way. The committee concluded that they would not be justified in attaching any criticism or blame to the government for the way it discharged its responsibilities in the period leading up to the invasion. Not blame for the specific handling. Not criticism. None. Critics at the time seized on exactly this. The report, they said, condemned the government across 338 paragraphs and then acquitted it in the 339th. And once you have read the body, that criticism is hard to shake. How do you list the missed signals and then rule that nobody was at fault? The answer lies in those narrow terms of reference. Franks was not asked whether British policy over years had been wise or whether deterrence had been allowed to decay. He was asked a tighter question. Could this government, in the period leading up to the invasion, have foreseen and prevented the specific attack that happened on the 2nd of April? And on that narrow question, the committee had an honest defense. The junta itself advanced its timetable in the final weeks. The decision to invade was taken in Buenos Aires late and fast, in response to the South Georgia crisis. If the men who launched the invasion did not settle on the date until the last moment, then London could hardly have pinpointed it either. On the narrow question, paragraph 339 is defensible, but that is precisely the slight of the document. The evidence in the body answers a bigger question. Did Britain let its guard down, ignore a standing warning, and signal weakness for years? And on that question, the report's own pages say yes. The conclusion simply declines to ask it. By framing the failure as the unforeseeability of one specific date, the report dissolved the larger failure it had just spent 90 pages describing. Politically, it worked exactly as such things are meant to. The report cleared Thatcher and her ministers of blame just as the memory of a won war was carrying her toward re-election. Carrington was already gone, having taken responsibility before the inquiry even began. The government could point to the last paragraph and move on. And that is what makes the Franks report worth reading 4 decades later. It is not a cover-up. It did not hide the warnings. It printed them. The July 1981 assessment is there. The withdrawal of Endurance is there. The Argentine threats are there. Everything you would need to hold the government accountable is inside the same document that lets the government off. The inquiry did its research and then, in a single sentence, declined to draw the obvious conclusion from it. The paper trail exonerates and indicts at once, and it leaves the reader to decide which paragraph to believe.